Everyone, welcome to the CATF Pavilion here at COP28. My name is Jonathan Banks. I'm the Global Director for the Methane Program. I've been with CATF for a long time, 24 years, and I've been working on methane since the very earliest days of methane being a climate pollutant, really. The first studies on methane came out in the year 2000. And CATF was one of the first groups to start looking at methane and really try to push the issue. When I think back to those early days, I honestly could never have imagined where we would get to, especially at this COP. Just a couple of years ago at the launch of the Global Methane Pledge, it was, we felt like we were at this pinnacle of something, and to see how much further it's come. A couple of nights ago with the Methane Summit with high-level leaders from all over the world, including China and the U.S. and the UAE and others, pledging to go even farther and do even more, raising over $1 billion in grant money to drive change around the world. Truly an astounding thing, not nearly enough, we all know that, to do what's necessary, but a huge down payment on what is needed to drive the change. A lot of this COP around methane has really been around money and finance, and so this panel is to talk about that, to dig into some of these issues from some of the key actors in this space. I'm really excited to have the folks that we have here on this panel. We've got philanthropy, big banks, big private banks, big public banks. We've got some of the leading analysts of finance here, as well as the State Department, and I'll introduce all of them here in just a second. So I'm really excited to get this going. Let me introduce our guest here first. I'll try to do this in order here. We have Mohammed Sultan, who's the regional lead for Africa at the Global Methane Hub. If you don't know the Global Methane Hub, you're probably in the wrong pavilion. So, but the Global Methane Hub is a consortium of funders that have come together to really drive philanthropic change in the methane space, and have been catalytic in getting money out to groups all over the world to be driving the change that's necessary and implementing projects to reduce methane emissions. And so it's really great to have Mohammed here. Then we got Zubin Bamji from the World Bank. Zubin is the manager of the World Bank's Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Program, which used to be the GGFR, is now the GFMR, and I will never be able to say that without looking at notes. See, I just did it. GFMR is a trust fund composed of governments and oil companies and multilateral organizations working to end routine flaring, and has now incorporated methane into its mission as well, helping to combine both of those key aspects into the work that they are doing. And then we have Bella from the U.S., who's the U.S. Director at Climate Policy Initiative, which does a lot of analysis and advisory to nonprofit as a nonprofit organization, and they work kind of at the nexus of finance and policy for climate change. And then second to last, Andre Abidi is the managing director with JP Morgan's Center for Carbon Transition. Andre leads the work at CCT, where they have a global mandate to provide clients in the corporate and investment bank and commercial banking with centralized access to sustainability-focused financing, research, and advisory solutions. And then last, but definitely not least, is Claire Henley, who is a special advisor in the Office of the Special Climate Envoy. I always get it wrong, SPEC. But she works very closely with John Kerry and the team over there at SPEC to really lead the catalytic catalytic efforts that are going on around the world to first launch the global methane pledge, but then to do all the work to continue to drive that forward. So with that, I will start us off with, I'm not seeing any slides here, but is it my, okay. Well, I can get us going without it. All right, so the main reason, one of the big reasons we're here to talk about finance really is that methane finance has been when you look at the impact of methane to climate, it's currently causing about half the warming we're feeling. So out of the 1.2-ish degrees that we are currently experiencing, methane is responsible for about a half a degree of that. Now, when you look at climate finance and methane finance, methane is getting nowhere near the kind of finance that measures up to the impact that methane is causing in our climate. So there's a disconnect between what is being caused in the atmosphere and what is being financed. Climate finance is woefully inadequate, but methane finance is on a whole nother level of inadequate. There's been, CPI has done some really great work over the last couple of years of looking at this gap that exists in the methane space. They broke this out in between waste, fossil fuels, and ag. And the numbers are astounding. In the waste sector, they're tracking about 7.3 billion with a need of about 44.3 billion. In ag and forestry, about 4.3 billion with a need of 43 billion. And in fossil fuels, about 100 million and about 31.6 billion needed. So the numbers are staggering. The gap is huge. There's a tremendous need for increased finance, which is why what we've seen in the last few days, why there's been so much focus on finance. After last year's COP, the State Department launched the Methane Finance Sprint with the goal of raising not much money, and 200 million. And then we far exceeded that with the $1 billion raised. But still, that leaves still a huge gap that needs to be closed in order to be able to really realize the benefit of methane mitigation. The work that's the finance piece is critical, especially in the developing world, where we need new finance mechanisms to be able to get funding to communities, funding to governments, funding to organizations to be able to implement the kinds of projects. And so I'm excited to be able to talk with the folks up here about some of the innovative work that they're doing to bring new financial mechanisms, to bring new efforts in this space. So I thought maybe we could start. We've got about 8 minutes for each of us up here to start, and then we'll go into some questions. And Bella, why don't we start with you? I think you'd probably be good to kind of give us a much better overview than what I just did. But we can start with you and go from there. Okay, floor is yours.
Sure, thanks, Jonathan. It's great to be here. So I'm Bella Tonkanogi. I'm with Climate Policy Initiative. If you've heard of us, you've probably seen what we fondly call our spaghetti chart, which is a chart of global climate finance flows, where we look at the sources of climate finance, what kinds of instruments are used, and then the destinations, both in terms of geography and sector. We've been doing this now since 2011, and we released our latest installment of the Global Landscape of Climate Finance a couple weeks ago, which showed very in a positive way that global climate finance flows have crossed $1 trillion for the first time. That's all climate finance. And what we started to do now last year, and this is going to be the second year that we've done this, is in partnership with Global Methane Hub, the Global Methane Partnership, we have looked very specifically at financial flows for methane abatement. So just a couple days ago, we released that second installment of that report, which Jonathan was just mentioning. And the story is, it's interesting, right? It's similar to all global climate finance flows. We see, as Jonathan mentioned, that methane abatement finance falls far short of the needs. We were able to track about $13.7 billion in methane abatement finance. The needs are around $40 billion for 2030, and they scale actually quite dramatically, the needs up through 2050. So we're not where we need to be. We tracked it in the wastewater sector, in the agriculture, forestry, land use sector, and we sort of tracked it in the fossil fuel sector. One of the biggest issues in the fossil fuel sector is just lack of data around financing, around methane abatement finance. We're really hoping that we can get better data in the future around that, and really looking forward to some of these partnerships to help us do that. So I can tell you a little bit more about some of those numbers that we found, some of the things that I thought were most interesting about that. I think first, we did see funding for methane abatement and finance for methane abatement increase since last year's installment, actually about 18%. Most of that came from the AFOLU sector. I'm just going to make sure. Yes, driven by the sharp rise in manure to energy activities. And a lot of that actually is coming from the U.S., where we're seeing some pretty stepped up funding activities, including, for example, in California, which has been rapidly increasing its grant funding for biodigester projects. So we are seeing increases in financing, mostly driven by the AFOLU sector. The waste sector accounts for about 45% of the finance we've tracked, driven mainly by wastewater management and solid waste energy management. That has decreased actually from the previous year. A lot of that we're seeing is a lot of the finance in that sector is actually coming from the public sector, although there is private investment there. And then in terms of the recipients, what we did in this latest installment was look at methane emissions and where the methane emissions are coming from regionally, so Latin America, Southeast Asia, US, Europe, East Asia, Africa, and then how much finance is flowing, and really trying to understand the difference between where the emissions are coming from and where the finance is flowing. And so in this latest report, what we're showing is that for some sectors, for some regions, finance is flowing maybe even more as a proportion than the emissions from that region. But then in other regions like Latin America and Southeast Asia in particular, we're seeing far less financing flowing as a proportion. It needs to increase everywhere, but proportionally we're seeing that that a few regions are actually really just not getting enough investment in methane abatement. So I think I will close there. There's a lot of numbers. I did have a couple slides which make the numbers a lot easier to understand. So sorry for throwing just like data at you. If you are a visual learner, that is like probably completely incomprehensible. But happy to share them with you after, and also to just share the link to our report, which has all of that and a lot of visuals that will really help you understand better kind of the numbers that are coming out. But like I said, we're really excited about this partnership. There's so much that we can do in methane abatement. It is hugely important. We've worked also on the innovative finance side, actually supporting some innovative financial instruments in methane. And we also work in the international financial architecture space, actually helping to think through some of the reforms that could really drive more emissions reductions. And I think there's a lot of space, and hopefully as we keep this discussion going, we can talk through what are some of the opportunities to actually get that methane abatement finance from where it is today to where it needs to be. So thank you.
Thank you, Bella. Maybe turn to Zubin next. Yep. Okay. There's been a lot of attention for what the $1 billion and the World Bank's role in that space. The new fund that the bank is going to administer to try to address mitigation of methane. Tell us about the bank's journey from just flaring to methane and flaring, and what you see going forward with this new fund.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks to Clean Air Task Force for inviting us. So I won't throw out a lot of data either, except what was this, B8 room 88? Jokes aside, no, thanks. We're happy to talk about this new fund that we're launching here at COP because of Bella's paper and the work that her organization did. It really made the case for us to step in and support this effort globally. We used to have a small trust fund at the World Bank that Jonathan mentioned that focused on flaring. And it was a small trust fund of a few $1 million that provided technical assistance to developing countries, those governments that had the least capacity, resources, technical knowledge to address flaring. But now we're happy that we'll have significantly more money, which we can actually call catalytic funding, if you will, which would then be devoted to actually doing the projects, because I think a lot of analytical work has been done, a lot of research. I think we know the impacts and the problems. Methane is tricky to measure, as you all know, and there's been vast improvements in detection technology, but there's still a big gap there that we're seeing, but that shouldn't stop us from doing the work, because it's an urgent climate necessity, as all of you know. So what we want to do with this funding that we're getting from the United States and the UAE and Germany and Norway and many of the international oil companies is provide these funds, again, to these governments and countries that have the least resources. We meet with them on a regular basis, and one of the first things we hear governments say in some of these countries is, we can't make sense of it all. Where do we even begin? There's all these initiatives here. There's all these organizations here. Everybody's trying to do something, and it's a little bit confusing. So one of the things that we'd like to do is try and make sense of it all to these governments and sort of hold their hands and lock arms and develop long-term sustainable programs that will address methane emissions. One of the things I do want to mention is there are three things that we really think are key when we apply some of this funding to a government's flaring or methane reduction program. And the main thing is the government needs to demonstrate a commitment to long-term programmatic reduction efforts. So as you all know, in some of these governments and countries, the governments change quite a lot. And it's hard to determine whether the next government is going to prioritize this as the current government. So this is one of the challenges that we confront, but we still insist that many of these governments make at least a couple of commitments right off the bat to demonstrate that commitment. So one thing is that we want governments to support the OGMP 2.0 effort. Some of you are familiar with that. That's the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. It's a reporting framework. We think it's powerful and effective and will help. That's one thing that we want governments to do. Number two, we want governments also to focus on flaring, of course, and make the commitment to end routine flaring within the next couple of years by 2030. It's a tall order, but we need to do it. It's been going on 160 years, ever since oil production began. And that's way too long, right? So we're hopeful that we'll support that effort, and the government has to make that commitment. And then the third item that we want governments to make a commitment towards is a methane intensity target. And again, some of these governments, it's a tall order for them to even achieve one or two of these, and we'll work with them to, move towards that direction. But that's what we're hoping to do. And again, our new trust fund will be catalytic funding to do the actual projects. We're not going to finance the projects necessarily. We might in some cases, but they have to go through a whole set of criteria that makes it really rigorous. But we will provide the funding to do pre-feasibility studies to show governments, NOCs, that actually some of this work can be done at a relatively lower cost with high potential for achieving some methane reduction. And then we'll support governments find the financing as well, which is a big task, of course, but that's something that we want to do too, because we think we understand this space quite well. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Zubin. So let's maybe go to the private banks and go to Andre. Pass the mic around. Oh, there we go. So JP Morgan it has just recently done some quite a bit of work to start to prioritize methane and focus on methane as an opportunity within the bank. Tell us, I read through the work that you all put out. It was pretty exciting to see. Tell us a little bit about JP Morgan's journey and why you guys are coming to methane as well from the private side of things. I think it's super interesting to get both the public bank as well as the private bank perspective here.
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan. I'm actually going to borrow from a lot of what Zubin was saying. I also had a few slides, so I'm going to wing it a little bit, but just to give you the journey to begin with, and why it is banks are starting to look at not only methane, but more broadly at emissions across all sectors. We were actually the first US bank to issue what at the time we called a Paris-aligned financing commitment. We then, at COP26, had the birth of GFANZ and NZBA, so the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. We're part of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. As part of that, the expectation is that banks actually set interim targets for most of the carbon intensive sectors that we have financial exposure to. And no surprise, oil and gas and ags, of course, are two of the sectors that have been defined. So where we started several years back was to actually, first of all, set 2030 interim targets on a carbon intensity basis for a number of sectors. We started with oil and gas, power, and automotive. We've since added steel, cement, aviation, shipping, and aluminium. Next year, we're going to have to tackle the beast that is ags. So we're going to start getting into, AFOLU and starting to think about what methane actually means in that context. But specifically for the oil and gas sector, when we went about setting targets, what we recognized very early on is it didn't make sense to set a combined scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions target for the oil and gas sector, because scope 3 would very quickly dwarf the scope 1 and 2 realities of what oil and gas companies were dealing with. And also the way in which you go about addressing those is different. Scope 3 is more a strategic, what is my business model going to be going forward, whereas scope 1 and 2, of course, is more what are my operational emissions and what do I need to do specifically to address those. So we actually defined 2 targets. We had an operational target, which was scope 1 and 2, and then a scope 3 target, which we've since changed, but we can come on to that in the questions if need be. But as far as the scope, certainly the scope 1 element of the operational target, as you would expect, methane was the most significant chunk of it. It was about, I think, between methane and flaring, 75-80% of the actual reduction target came through in terms of numerical terms. So we very quickly realized, okay, this is a key element of us, first of all, understanding what our clients are even doing about this. And I think that is the next step. Setting a target is one thing, and understanding contextually what the targets mean when you're setting it against a base or a baseline starting point and what your scenario is going to be. And we've used the IEA net zero scenario. So we looked specifically at where our clients were starting from a baseline perspective. So we get the data, for instance, from Wood Mackenzie, some of you may know, and that gives us a starting point to understand what the methane intensity is and whether or not clients even have methane targets. And I think that began the journey. First of all, visually having a look at what these numbers were and what it would take for us to get from a baseline starting point in 2020 through 2030. So we've actually now gone through a process where every single transaction we do for all clients in all sectors that we have targets for, but certainly for the oil and gas sector, every single transaction, we evaluate the client, we actually score them numerically. So we have, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but we have a scorecard, which in essence looks at the intensity against both the trajectory that we're aiming for and the intensity versus their peer group. So that gives us a bucketing. It gives us a sense for where this client is relative to where it should be and where its peers are. And that is taken into account in our decision making. But then specifically, if I fast forward a couple of years on, we started seeing that there didn't appear to be a lot of action amongst the clients. And so we decided, in fact, we hired someone from Environmental Defense Fund, Ben Ratner, who was the author of the paper that we've since released. And this is one of Ben's, I'll say, passion projects, if you can talk about methane and passion. But I mean, that certainly is one of the areas that he is most excited about. So he certainly felt there was an opportunity here for us not to just objectively sit back and have a number on a page and solve for it, but actually lean in and understand what clients were doing and start proposing how we could intervene and provide solutions. And to be honest, it's still early days, I will suggest. What we are looking at is a combination of things. In our commercial bank, we have a green economy team that is starting to look at some of both the hardware tech players, the companies that can actually go and tighten the pipes and what have you to figure out or to help measure where the emissions actually are. We're also seed funding a lot of the climate tech from a software perspective to give us better data visually and a better understanding of how you would monitor and eventually manage certainly methane and other environmental releases. So we're starting to look at where it is we can intervene, actually build up some of the capabilities within the market to provide some of the solutions to clients, provide some of the data solutions. And then on the corporate and investment banking side also, what we've started doing is looking at labeled financial products. So some of you will be familiar with things like green bonds, sustainability-linked loans, etc. So can we actually look at ways in which you can structure a KPI around methane to incentivize the client to take certain actions? And clearly these KPIs need to be ambitious, they need to be measurable, etc. And so we've certainly had a couple of conversations with clients around doing that. So that's certainly the way in which we see a role that we can play in as I said, both from the perspective of providing some of the actual technical solutions or data and data and mapping, visual mapping, to actually getting into, can we structure finance such that clients will actually start looking at managing the issues more effectively. That's what's contained in our paper. In essence, it sets out some of those details. It sets out our 8 expectations, if you will, about how a company should start thinking about methane management, which I think will be obvious, and we can send the paper around, of course. What I will say, just in closing, is my team, I'm London-based, so on one hand, we implement against these net zero targets that we've been setting. We also evaluate all of the labeled products that clients are doing across sectors. So again, green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, sustainability-linked loans, etc. So we scrutinize whether or not the use of proceeds are fit for purpose. We scrutinize whether or not the KPIs are ambitious enough, and I would suggest that we've seen over time the market has improved, but there are still question marks. But what I will say is the oil and gas sector is pretty much underserved when it comes to these products, largely because investors don't think an oil and gas company should be raising a green bond or a sustainability-linked bond even. There are a couple in the market. And so that's an open question for us to consider as well, is are you going to get companies who are willing to step out and say, okay, I am going to not discreetly, but distinctively raise capital with KPIs specifically for my methane abatement project? Is that something that the market has appetite for? Do investors have appetite for that? Does civil society recognize that that actually is necessary? And I think the fact that the World Bank is stepping into the space is interesting because, of course, there's been, ever since the Extractive Industries Review back in 2002, when the World Bank looked at what is our role when it comes to the fossil fuel sector, I think it's pretty significant that the World Bank is recognizing actually this is an important enough topic for us to lean in on. And so I think that's a key element. And last thing I'd say is, because of the fact that most banks are now setting these net zero 2030 targets. And also because of the fact that, to be honest, we're not going to get there through labeled products. So you're not going to issue a number of green bonds and that'll take care of things. A lot of what we're now considering, and there's going to be a couple of announcements today around transition finance. What actually is transition finance? What activities need to be brought into the fold for us to say it's appropriate to start allocating capital to these types of activities? And I think methane is one of those. So it's going to be an interesting space to watch. Certainly, we're leaning into it, as I said, looking at both structures and how we can actually start seed funding some of the solutions. But I'd say still quite a ways to go.
Keep doing that. Thanks, Andre. That was fantastic to hear. And I want to come back to you in a minute with some questions. But let's go to philanthropy now. And Mohammed, I'd love to hear. You guys have been doing a tremendous amount of work to seed all of these efforts and to help in multiple venues to bring more finance to bear, and being a financer yourself of financing projects, financing efforts around the world. Tell us a little bit about what GMH is doing and where you see the focus going from here for GMH on the finance side of things.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Apologies for my voice fluing this morning. So if you can't hear, I'll try to speak as loud as I can. And it's great to be amongst esteemed speakers. So the Global Methane Hub, as you know, is a philanthropic endeavor. We work across three sectors: waste, energy, and agriculture, to try to really accelerate action on methane. And finance is obviously a key consideration for us, but it's one that we locate within the broader context of accountability, data, transparency, and overall sort of inclusion of actors. And I say this because it's important. It's really interesting to hear that from the financial perspective, the importance of having data that underpins decision-making and that also underpins mid and long-term accountability. And we've invested quite a bit in making sure that we are able to understand where emissions are coming from, what the impacts of mitigation efforts are, and how they can be course-corrected or how they are aligned or not with objectives. And that's been really important to us, to link the data and the measurement to financing opportunities. On the financing front, obviously, you mentioned the $1 billion, but obviously it's not enough money, and it's not, what we have is not enough to be able to address these issues. So we want to be as catalytic as possible. And what we mean by catalytic, it is supporting existing pool of resources to target methane in a way that makes the effort more sophisticated and more powerful. It is also about opening up new opportunities, precisely like you said, Bella, to places that probably require more money because of the impact that is required to abate in the mid and long term. So that means, in particular, on existing pools of capital with multilateral development banks, regional development banks, understanding their overall portfolio. A lot of them do already work on waste, do already work on some form of energy, do already work on agriculture. It is about bringing the technical capacity to understand what methane abatement and management can do within existing portfolios to really accelerate action. And that's across sort of regions and across different types of organizations. We've had partnerships with the American Development Bank, particularly on waste, that's looking very promising, in conversations with the African Development Bank. But even that's not enough. And so understanding the role that the private sector will play in some sectors is really, really important. In the energy space, for example, it is going to be critical. And I think we're also in the early stages of trying to understand to what extent we could facilitate greater transparency, and also regional and contextual approaches to the work, and that's going to be something that we're going to be looking at a lot more going forward. It is also the case that in the three sectors, the sources of financing will be different. Some will be more predominantly towards the private sector. In other cases, particularly in the waste sector, there will be a lot of public resources and financing. And so even there, public accountability and governance is going to be really, really critical, but also understanding the impact of differentiated actions. And that's why we link very much the technical support and capacity that we provide through a number of actors to the actual allocation of resources. But we need more innovation, and we need a wider pool of money. In the agricultural space, very difficult. It's a shame my colleague Hayden is not here. He could talk at length about the difficulties in allocating resources to agriculture, but we're launching an entire accelerator that's really trying to crowd in resources with public and private to accelerate breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs, to then support more targeted and more impactful work, even though there's still quite a ways to go in that front. But I want to close maybe with a couple of thoughts. As a philanthropic actor, of course, our goal is also to make sure that methane action and methane mitigation has a very clear social dynamic. And so the financing that we also tend to provide is also opening up the space for civil society, for non-state actors to be not only part of the sort of shaping of domestic action, particularly in certain sectors, in the waste sector, and embedding principles of equity and justice, and making sure that the process of accountability is also adequately financed, that the process of participation is also adequately financed. And so we have a layered approach, expanding the pool of capital, improving the quality of public and private capital that is going to mitigation efforts, facilitating collaboration, merging technical capacity to the financing, and then obviously opening up the sector to a much wider set of actors that have immense opportunities to make sure that we are moving in a direction that is responsible and that also factors in really principles of equitable outcomes, equitable participation. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. All right, Claire, you guys at SPEC have been very, you have a pretty kick-ass rate of return on investment with the methane finance sprint. You set out to raise 200 million. You generated about $1 billion. That's pretty awesome. I should have invested in that. I don't have any money to invest, but that's okay. Tell us a little bit about, where you see the U.S. efforts going. We all know $1 billion is not anywhere enough. Where do you see the U.S.'s efforts going from here forward to continue to accelerate the attention for methane finance and drive more money flowing into this space?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jonathan. And really great to be here on this panel. Great to be here in this room. I think that methane can be a passion project, as we are all showing. But yeah, it's been a really big few days for methane. It continues this evening. We've got the methane ministerial at 6:30 today, which we're very excited about. I think the $1 billion is what, we did greatly over-deliver, and I think it's a sign that excitement is increasing about this topic. People are starting to get it. It's not only on the funding side, but also in terms of the regulatory commitments, the action plans, the countries joining the Global Methane Pledge. China's action plan is, of course, extremely exciting. So I think the funding is a good sign that people are interested in this space. But you ask a great question, Jonathan, which is where do we go from here? And we know that the grant funding needs to be a down payment on larger investment, on concessional funding, on blended finance, if we're going to achieve what Bella has talked about and your team has so artfully done to map out where we need to be on methane funding to achieve the pledge. And so from a State Department perspective, we are really thinking about how do we use the levers of government to influence those broader financial flows. And I'll talk about a few levers. The first is through bilateral development assistance. So we all know the USAIDs, the GIZs, the JICAs of the world that are going out and doing a lot of projects in a lot of relevant countries, in a lot of relevant sectors. And in many cases, a lot of that work is happening right now. There's livestock work happening, there's waste work happening, there's even oil and gas work happening. But people are not necessarily thinking about the methane impact of that work, and they're definitely not tracking the methane impact of that work. And we've had conversations in collaboration with our USAID colleagues with these other bilateral aid agencies where they're saying, we have no idea what our methane impact is. Oh yes, we spend millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in the waste sector or in the ag sector, but we have no idea what our methane impact is. And that's a pretty substantial problem and opportunity. The problem is that they're not tracking it, and there may be missed opportunities to put in a little more investment in a waste project or a little more investment in an ag project and achieve a methane benefit. And the opportunity is we've got this huge portfolio of work that's going on that can be, as we like to say in the U.S. State Department, where we come up with great catchy terms, methanized. So that's, how we think about integrating methane work across, in particular, waste and ag, but also kind of more broadly development, including energy access. So I think that is the work. The next step in this work is to take this grant funding, is to work with private sector financial institutions, with bilateral aid agencies, with other international financial institutions, to make sure that they are paying attention to and tracking methane in a way that allows for this additional impact to come to these programs. And the flip side of that is that it allows for more funding to come to some of the co-benefits here, which are health, which are increased agricultural productivity, which are improved, waste treatment systems, and all the benefits of that. So I think there's really a great story here if we can make sure and infiltrate financial flows. And I'll just give you just one kind of idea of the opportunity. The International Fund for Agricultural Development has a pipeline of $500 million of projects in these relevant sectors that currently where they're not thinking about methane. That needs to change. The World Bank has a portfolio of billions of dollars in these sectors where they're not currently, though they're starting to, with help from Zubin and his colleagues, but they're not adequately considering methane, and that is changing. And so I think that is the kind of next step in this work, and I'm personally really excited about it. So thanks for having me, Jonathan.
Thanks, Claire. And I love the term methanize, but every time I use it, everybody in my science team yells at me because it actually has a scientific meaning, and it's the opposite of what we're trying to do. So, but I still use it. So, we've got. I get so many text messages I can't even see my watch. We've got a few minutes for questions. Maybe Andre, I'd love to start with you. I mean, you guys, J.P. Morgan stepped out here on methane. How do we get what's necessary? The other private banks thinking about this kind of in the way that you've been going through your own journey, and how do we move the rest of the banks into this space? Because I think when Claire's talking about how we begin to leverage the necessary funding that's going to come, most of it's going to end up coming from the private sector instead of the public sector. And so how do we get the rest of the banking community moving in this space?
I think it's so there's probably a few thoughts, and I'd say it's not just the banking community. I think it's the investor community as well. So just reflecting, as I said, on how we went about this, we were deliberate in making sure we separated, as I said, scope 1, 2, and 3, just because you need to actually stare at the problem to understand the magnitude of it. And I think other banks have not yet done that. They have a combined score, so methane's an afterthought, would be my expectation. And so some of it may just be literally the banks figuring it out and recognizing, and hopefully the fact that we've now taken a front-footed approach on this, it does resonate. It typically does when we do so. So one is just trying to socialize the idea even more than we have, and hopefully other banks will come to the same realization of the importance of this. As I said, we've only started in oil and gas, and we've still got to figure out. Waste is never going to be one of the carbon-intensive sectors or targets that banks are setting, but a lot of the financing we're doing in the commercial bank green economy team is around waste management. And as I said, next year we're going to start figuring out ags. But as I said earlier, a lot of this also is going to be dependent on whether or not oil and gas companies say, okay, I'm willing to actually go out there and try and raise capital in the public market as an oil and gas company. Are investors even going to give me the time of day to have this conversation? And so I think there needs to be, a realization or education of this, and certainly a lot of the announcements that have happened in the last couple of days here at COP focus on the topic. So yes, banks need to play a part, but I think the investors also need to lean in as well.
Thank you. That's great. My next question's for everyone because all of you alluded to it or touched on it directly. We've got a new facility at the bank targeting methane and flaring within the oil and gas sector. You talked about the Enteric Accelerator, which is really trying to bring forward new solutions and all the scientific research that has to go into that. The space that you've all kind of touched on is the waste sector and the need for a different sort of financial mechanism. I think, Bella, you brought it up specifically, different financial mechanisms that can actually get funding to the projects and the communities that need this. Because as we all know, in the waste sector, you're not dealing with national governments, you're not dealing with giant companies or anything like that. You're dealing with communities that need funding, the technical support to be able to implement projects. So I'd love anybody's thoughts on what's necessary to be able to begin delivering these alternative financial mechanisms that can get money to the places where it's needed, especially in the waste sector. So anyone can jump forward. You want to go?
Happy to start. First, I have a suggestion for another term. Instead of methanized, I was thinking about it as you were saying it, and I think maybe instead of mainstreamed, maybe methane streamed. I'm excited about that one. I think I agree methane can be a passion project, so I think that's the other takeaway from this panel. In terms of innovative finance, we have been running something called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. Actually, we're starting our 10th year next year. And we will have 10 new instruments next year, which we're very excited about. We have a call for ideas open right now. So if any of you have innovative finance ideas in this sector or others, please do look that up. And we've worked now with about over 60 teams who've mobilized more than $4 billion in investment. And most of these are blended finance deals. So, as you were talking, Claire, about blended finance, and we have had a few actually looking at methane. One in hydropower, but we haven't actually had that many methane ideas in the lab or methane investment products or financial vehicles. The other thing I was thinking about was that earlier this morning I was at the State Department's launch of the Blended Finance and Energy Transition Mechanism, which is part of a broader collaboration of a number of governments around investment mobilization and blended finance. And I do think there is something to be said for calling out specifically the things that you want to solve for, the problems you want to solve for. And so, having something out there, a thematic window for any of these many incubators and accelerators that are out there that says, we are looking for solutions in the methane space, I think would generate a lot of interest, a lot of ideas, especially if it comes with the technical assistance that these incubators offer. Some of them offer funding directly or a pathway to financing from some of the public entities that do have financing available. And I think the partnership for, the pilot auction facility for methane and the World Bank used to run also kind of accomplished that, right? That it's, if you call something out specifically and said, this is a problem we want to address, who has the ideas? Because we have some ideas, but we certainly don't have all the ideas. Who has those ideas? Who's a fund manager or a financial product innovator who might be able to come to us with something new? I think that would be really, really interesting to take a look at.
Anyone else want to throw any thoughts out? Nope.
Yeah, sorry. Maybe just one thing on that we've been working on quite a bit. It's precisely to support project preparation at different levels in country. I think what we're seeing is that sometimes when the capital is available, whether public or private, there seems to be a mismatch between what's needed, how it's presented, how it's offered, how it's developed, versus where the capital sits. And I think there's immense work that could be done there to make sure that the pipelines of potential projects at different scale are made more visible through different investment pipelines. There's obviously, I think, for the private sector, really an opportunity and a need to sort of co-educate the different sectors. The investment sector to understand a little bit better methane, and on the other side, sort of the world of action to understand a little bit better how the investment space operates. So I think there's opportunities to find creative and innovative ways to bring people together in a way that previously they may not have been able to engage and interact.
Great, thank you. Zubin, you talked about using the new funding that you have as a way to leverage much greater funding. The bank has successful experience in this space. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how the bank has leveraged funding in the past to achieve greater?
Yeah, sure. And I think Andre touched on this too. Within the bank, we're moving governments or helping governments and countries move away from fossil fuels. And here we are, coming up and saying, no, actually, let's lean in on this agenda. So this was also a signal to the market, if you will, right? That, look, if the World Bank feels like this is important, it can actually open some doors and bring in some additional banks. And what you're talking about, Jonathan, is more about that when the World Bank invests in a project or a certain initiative, then there is this multiplier effect, if you will, where you have the confidence for the private sector to come in. So when we fund a project, that, the numbers vary, but the number that we always talk about is about 7 times, if not more, the amount of money we put in, it generates in terms of private sector financing. So when you talk or read about our fund in the media or anywhere else, you'll see we talk about this notion of we'll put in a certain amount of money, but expect billions to be generated from that certain amount of money. Without getting into the mechanics of how that happens, there is that whole multiplier effect that we really want to focus on. That's going to be key to achieve the numbers that Bella talked about at the outset. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Okay, so we have like 3 minutes left. Maybe one question from the audience, if we have one. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Julia Solana, and I'm with the Center for Climate Crime Analysis. I have a question for the two banks, actually. You've both mentioned taking into account methane intensity as part of the targets. And also the fact, I was really glad to hear actually that JP Morgan is splitting into scope 1, 2, and 3, the work that it's doing and looking at the scorecard in that sense. But I was wondering if you're also considering using different GWP potentials, depending on whether you're looking at scope 1, for example, would be a lot more appropriate to use the global warming potential over the 20-year timeline, for example, versus a 100-year timeline, given that you're financing projects and mitigating something that is happening now. And also whether part of the KPIs would be to look at absolute reductions as opposed to only at intensive methane intensity, because otherwise we'll end up with low intensity, but a whole bunch of methane in the atmosphere that we cannot actually afford. So I would just want to hear from both of you, what's your thought on that?
So it's still to be determined. I think the 20 versus 100 year, right now, the targets we've set are 2030. They are intensity based, but we all have to report absolute financed emissions numbers. So I think there's always the overlay of the aggregate of what our financed emissions are. Indeed, when it comes to some of the structures for clients, equally we need to look at not only intensity but absolute. And I think that this is just building on the point I was making earlier. I think what people need to recognize, and certainly if I think of some of the commitments that have happened over the last couple of days, we're talking about more production of gas because you're going to have more methane available as you're actually moving from the 2 to 3% total methane that currently escapes down to 0.2% or near zero. that means that's going to be, a financial benefit for some of the oil and gas companies. I think we need to recognize that. I mean, that's part of the reality. So your question is absolutely the right one, which is, we get that. That means you're not releasing the methane, but that is actually cash flow for you. But still, there's the longer term objective. If you look at all of our 2050 scenarios, that fossil fuel use needs to come down. So that's not lost on us, but we're still thinking through exactly how those structures need to play out.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but you make a very good point. And we're going to just look at each project on its own merits, quite frankly, because again, some of these developing countries, just getting them to move even incrementally is a huge achievement at this point, I recall during the pandemic, there I was calling up governments, asking them to focus on this issue when they're just trying to keep people alive, right? So we have to keep things in perspective. I don't know if that directly answers your question. I think Andre answered it well, which is, of course, absolute. That's what we're looking for eventually.
Great, thank you. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining us here. Thank you for wandering around and being able to actually get here. It's an impressive feat of navigation to do so. You've all earned your navigation scouting badge that you will send you in the mail, and you can sew it on the side of your suit
New
coats.
terminology too, methanology. What was yours?
Yeah, we've got new terms. Yes. So if everybody could join me in a round of applause for everyone here.